There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over an old house at night, the kind you only notice when the world outside has gone still and cold. And if you're listening to this in the dark right now, wrapped in something warm, you already know that quiet. Come in from wherever you are, settle down, let your shoulders drop. Tonight we are going somewhere very old and very human, and I promise to take you there gently. Here is what you need to know before anything else. On a January night in England 700 years ago, staying alive until morning was not something a person could take for granted. Not everyone did. The difference between waking up and not waking up sometimes came down to a single fire kept burning, a single wall holding back the wind, a single body pressed close enough to another to share its warmth. This is a story about that thin, fragile margin, and about the people who learned, generation after generation, exactly how to survive inside it. Picture a small house in a village somewhere in the English countryside, its walls built from woven branches packed with clay and straw, its roof thick with thatch, gone dark and heavy with the season's damp. Inside, a woman kneels beside a hearth that sits not against a wall, but in the centre of the single room she and her family share, because there is no chimney here, only a gap left open in the roof above, and the smoke rises slow and grey toward it while the heat, more precious than the smoke, lingers low where the people are. She feeds the fire carefully, one thin piece of wood at a time, because there will not be more wood until morning, and morning is still many hours away. Her children lie already under everything the household owns that can hold in warmth. Wool blankets gone soft with years of use. A worn fur passed down from a grandmother, even the family's cloaks pulled from their hooks and laid across small bodies. On the other side of a low partition she can hear the animals shifting in their straw, the ox breathing slow and heavy, and she is glad of that sound because an animal's body gives off a heat of its own, and in a house like this nothing that generates warmth goes unused. She lies down beside her children last of all, not because the day's work is finished, but because there is nothing more she can do except be there, and being there matters. Outside, frost is already forming pale and silver along the edges of the thatch. What strikes most people when they first learn how ordinary families endured winters like this one is how much thought went into something we rarely think about at all. We flip a switch and a room grows warm. They built an entire architecture of survival around a single flame and around each other. Woolen stockings were pulled on before bed, not for style, but because feet lose warmth fastest of all. Stones were sometimes heated in the embers of the evening fire, wrapped carefully in cloth and carried to the foot of a straw mattress, a slow radiant comfort that could last long into the night. And there is something else. Something people rarely expect to hear, which is that medieval winter was not only endured, it was also in its strange and difficult way a season people came to know intimately, with its own rhythms, its own quiet pleasures, carved out between the hardship its own particular kind of togetherness that the warmer months never quite demanded. Families who barely saw one another during the long working days of summer found themselves in the depths of winter, sitting shoulder to shoulder around the same small fire for hours at a time, night after night, with nowhere else warm enough to be. Before we go further into that world, into the villages and the fields and the long hard season that shaped so much of medieval life, I want to ask something of you, if you don't mind. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the real kind told without rushing and without needless drama, it helps enormously if you take a moment to subscribe and leave the video a like. It costs you nothing, and it tells me that stories like this one are worth continuing to tell. And if you have a moment, I would love to know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what it was about this story that pulled you in. I read every one, even the ones left at 3 in the morning, especially those. Now get comfortable, because there is a great deal more to tell you, and we have all the time in the world, That single household, that single fire held carefully through a January night, was not an isolated case. It was the ordinary condition of life for the overwhelming majority of people living in medieval Europe. And to understand why, you have to understand the world they were born into, a world governed almost entirely by the turning of the seasons and the demands of the land beneath their feet. There was no factory whistle to mark the beginning of a person's day, no wage waiting at the end of a fixed week. There was only the sun, the soil, and the calendar of the church, which told a farming family when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest, and when, as the nights grew long and the fields fell silent under frosts, to turn inward and simply endure. Winter was not a season a medieval peasant chose to prepare for. It was a season that had been preparing to arrive since the very first day of spring, and everything a family did throughout the warmer months. The grain they threshed, the animals, they fattened the wood they gathered and stacked against a southern wall to dry, existed in service of the cold months that were always eventually coming. To understand how people faced those freezing nights, we first have to step back and see the whole shape of the world they lived inside. A world built entirely around the knowledge that the warmth of summer was borrowed and that winter always collected the debt. The year a medieval farming family lived by did not begin in January. It began for most practical purposes at Michaelmas, in the last days of September, when the harvest was finally in and the rents were due, and a new agricultural cycle quietly opened its first page. This detail surprises people more often than you would expect the idea that autumn, not winter, and not spring was the true hinge of the medieval calendar. Michaelmas was when new leases began, when servants and labourers were hired for the coming year, when a household took stock of what it had gathered and what it would need to survive on until the land woke again. It is a strange thing to sit with that the season we associate with cold and hardship actually opened with a kind of accounting, a careful human ritual of counting grain sacks and cheese wheels and firewood, trying to calculate as precisely as anyone could whether there was enough. There usually was not quite enough. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it changes how you understand everything that follows. A family working a modest strip of land, perhaps 10 or 12 acres, scattered across the village's open fields, might produce a harvest that fed them adequately in a good year and left them dangerously short in a poor one, and the difference between those two outcomes was rarely something they controlled. Too much rain in the summer and the grain rotted in the ear, too little and it withered before it ripened. A late frost in spring could destroy an entire planting overnight, and there was no insurance, no government relief, no neighbouring region shipping, in surplus by rail because none of that existed yet. What existed was the family, the land, the weather, and whatever had been saved from the year before. Historians who study manorial records, the detailed account books that lords and their stewards kept of rents, yields, and obligations, have found that even in ordinary years, a significant portion of the peasantry lived close enough to the edge that a single bad harvest could tip a household from hardship into genuine crisis. Winter, in other words, was not simply cold. Winter was the season in which every miscalculation, every shortfall, every piece of bad luck from the previous 10 months finally came due. The land itself in this period sat inside a social structure. Most modern listeners find difficult to picture clearly, so it helps to walk through it plainly without judgment, simply as it was. A great deal of medieval Europe operated under what historians now call the manorial system, in which a lord, whether a nobleman, a bishop, or a monastery, held the legal right to a stretch of land, and the peasants who lived and worked upon it owed him a portion of their labour, their produce, or both, in exchange for the right to farm their own strips and live under whatever protection his position afforded them. Some of these peasants were free, able to leave if they chose, though few had anywhere better to go. Others were bound to the land itself, tied by birth to a lord and a manor, They could not legally abandon obligated to work his fields for a set number of days each week before they were permitted to tend their own. It was not slavery in the way the ancient world understood it, but it was not freedom either. And the distinction, subtle as it can seem from a distance of 7 centuries, mattered enormously to the people living inside it. A villain, as the bound peasants of England were often called, might owe his lord several days of ploughing every week during the busiest planting and harvest seasons, and only after those obligations were met could he turn to the work that would actually feed his own family through the winter ahead. What this meant practically was that a peasant household's margin for error was thinner than most of us can easily imagine. Every hour spent ploughing the Lord's fields was an hour not spent securing one's own harvest. Every egg, every hen, every measure of grain owed as rent was food that would not be sitting in the family's own stores when the frost arrived. And so the approach of winter carried with it a particular kind of quiet anxiety that had nothing to do with the cold itself, not yet, but with the deeper question underneath it whether there was enough, truly enough, laid up to last until the fields could be worked again. There is a rhythm to how this fear moved through a village, and it is visible even now in the records that survive. Historians have traced the way that autumn was consumed almost entirely by preservation, a frantic, unglamorous, essential labour that rarely appears in the popular imagination of the medieval world, but that determined more than almost anything else who would live to see spring. Grain was threshed and stored in dry lofts, protected as best as possible from damp and from the mice that always found their way in regardless. Meat, when a family could afford to slaughter an animal rather than keep it through the winter, as a drain on scarce feed, was salted, smoked or dried because refrigeration in any modern sense simply did not exist, and spoiled meat in a hungry winter was not a small mistake, it could be a fatal one. Vegetables that could survive being buried, root crops especially, were packed into cool cellars or pits dug into the earth where the soil itself acted as a kind of natural preservation. Cheese dense and salted could last for months if kept properly, and became by midwinter a staple far more reliable than fresh food of any kind. Beer and cider were brewed not for celebration alone, but because fermentation was itself a form of preservation, turning perishable grain and fruit into something that would keep. Every single one of these tasks, unremarkable as they sound, was in fact an act of quiet, determined defiance against a season that intended, in its own indifferent way, to take as many lives as it could. And here scholars still disagree on quite a lot, which is worth saying honestly rather than smoothing over. We know from manorial accounts roughly how much grain a typical village produced, and roughly what portion went to rent to seed for the next planting and to the household's own consumption, but translating those numbers into a clear picture of how hungry any individual family actually was during a given winter remains genuinely difficult. Yields varied enormously by region and by soil. Household sizes varied. A widow farming alone faced an entirely different winter than a family with several grown sons to share the labour. What the evidence does allow us to say with real confidence is this, that hunger, or the close and constant fear of it, was woven into the fabric of medieval winter life, in a way that shaped nearly every decision a rural family made long before the first snow ever fell. It's worth pausing here on something easy to overlook, which is how differently this world experienced its own geography. A peasant in the south of France tending olive trees and vines under a winter sky that rarely dropped much below freezing, lived through a season that would have seemed almost gentle to a farmer in the fenlands of eastern England, or further still, to a family scraping a living from the thin soil of Highland Scotland or the long dark winters of Scandinavia. Northern communities accustomed across many generations to true cold had developed their own deep expertise, compact low houses built to hold in heat skis and sledges to move across snow that would have stranded a southern traveller entirely layered furs suited to temperatures that would have astonished a farmer from the Mediterranean coast. Move a family from one climate to the other, historians have noted, and the hardship of an ordinary winter could feel to each of them entirely unfamiliar and entirely severe simply because the body in the household had never been asked to adapt to that particular cold before. Brutal, in other words, was never a fixed number of degrees. It was relative to what a place and a people had built their lives to withstand. By the time the last of the harvest was gathered in and the final stores sealed away against the damp, a kind of stillness settled over the medieval countryside, the fields falling silent, the roads growing quieter, the working year folding gently in on itself. It would have been easy, standing in a village at that moment, to believe the hardest part of the year was still safely distant. But the climate this entire agricultural world had been built around, the pattern of mild winters and dependable harvests that generations of peasant knowledge assumed would simply continue, was in certain centuries of the medieval period about to shift beneath their feet in ways no one farming that land could have anticipated. Long before that shift in weather ever touched the fields, the shelter a peasant family lived inside had already been shaped by centuries of trial, failure, and quiet refinement. And it is worth spending time here because the house itself was as much a survival technology as the fire burning inside it. Picture the earliest ancestors of that small house from a January night reaching back not decades but centuries to a time when a typical rural dwelling in much of Europe was a single round or oval structure, walls of woven branches packed with clay, a conical roof of thatch rising to a central point, and at its heart a fire pit sitting directly on the earthen floor with no chimney at all, only the gathered smoke finding its way out slowly through the thatch itself. It sounds primitive to modern ears, and in some ways it was, but it solved a problem that would define rural architecture for 1,000 years afterward: how to hold heat inside a structure using nothing but shape material and the placement of a single flame. The high, tightly woven roof trapped rising warmth beneath it, even as it let smoke filter gradually through, and the round form itself, with no corners to lose heat into, meant that a family gathered near that central fire sat inside what was in effect a very simple, very effective heat trap. Archaeologists who have reconstructed these early dwellings and lived inside them for research have found something that surprises people every time: that even in genuinely cold weather, a well-built roundhouse with a modest fire burning could hold a noticeably warmer, drier interior than its rough exterior would ever suggest. The people building these homes were not primitive in the way that word is often used carelessly. They were solving, with the materials available to them, one of the oldest problems a human community faces, and they were solving it well. As the centuries moved forward and the medieval period proper took shape, this basic architecture evolved region by region into forms suited to local materials and local cold. In parts of England, builders developed what is known as cruck construction, a method using great curved timbers often cut from a single naturally bent tree that rose from the ground and met at the roof's peak to form the essential skeleton of the house. Between these massive curved beams, builders filled the walls with wattle, a woven lattice of thin branches, and daub, a thick paste of clay straw and sometimes animal dung, worked by hand into every gap until the wall stood solid, breathable, and reasonably wind-resistant. It is a strange thing to say, but a well-maintained daub wall, though it looks fragile to modern eyes, could actually perform quite well against cold, better in fact than many people assume, because the mixture itself held a surprising amount of insulating air within its texture, so long as it was kept from cracking and was regularly repaired. That regular repair incidentally fell disproportionately to the women of a household who maintained the daub each year, patching the inevitable cracks left by rain and frost, in a labour so constant and so unremarked upon in the historical record that it very nearly vanished from our understanding of medieval life altogether, surviving mostly in the faint traces left in archaeological digs and in the rare household account that happened to mention it. The shape of the house itself tells another story worth pausing on, because by the later medieval period, many rural dwellings across England and much of northern Europe had adopted what historians call the longhouse form, a single elongated structure divided often by nothing more than a low wooden partition, or simply an unspoken understanding of space between the family's living area at one end and a byre, a shelter for cattle or other livestock at the other. This arrangement strikes many modern listeners as strange, even unpleasant, the idea of sleeping under the same roof as one's animals, but it was in the coldest months a matter of careful and deliberate calculation rather than simple necessity born of poverty alone. A full-grown ox or a small group of cattle generates a genuinely significant amount of body heat in a family that positioned its own sleeping quarters just beyond a shared wall. From that warmth was, in effect, running a low, steady, entirely free source of supplemental heating through the coldest nights of the year. Some regions took this logic further still. In parts of Iceland and Scandinavia, families built turf houses so thickly insulated with layered sod that the structures themselves seemed to grow directly out of the surrounding hillside, and in the harshest stretches of winter, householders sometimes spent long hours in shared indoor spaces built specifically to hold warmth, conserving fuel by conserving movement by simply staying still together in the smallest, warmest room a household possessed. None of this, it is important to say honestly, made a medieval winter comfortable in any way we would recognize today. Even the best-built house of this period, however cleverly designed, lacked glass in its windows for the ordinary peasant family, who instead stretched oiled cloth-thin animal hide, or simple wooden shutters across the openings, materials that blocked wind reasonably well, but let in almost no light and did nothing to hold in warmth the way glass eventually would. The floor beneath a family's feet was in the vast majority of homes simply packed earth, sometimes strewn with straw or rushes for a little cushioning and a little insulation, but always cold, always damp when the weather turned wet, and always a little unpredictable underfoot. Fire itself, that essential centre of every winter night, was in fact one of the single greatest dangers a medieval household faced. Thatched roofs, precisely the material that made these homes so effective at holding warmth, were also extraordinarily flammable, and manorial court records from across medieval England contain with grim regularity entries recording house fires that began from an untended hearth or a spark carried too far on a draught, sometimes destroying not just a single home, but spreading rapidly through the close-built timber and thatch of an entire village row. Staying warm and staying safe, in other words, were never quite the same goal, and every household spent the winter walking a careful, constant line between the two. There is a detail here that tends to surprise people, something easy to miss entirely if you only imagine medieval winter as a scene of grim endurance. The historical record drawn from a mixture of household accounts, church calendars, and the occasional surviving diary or chronicle suggests that winter, once the truly frantic labour of the harvest had passed, and the fields lay resting under frost, brought with it a strange and unexpected slowing, even a kind of leisure, for many rural families. With the heaviest agricultural work suspended until spring, a peasant household's days grew shorter in obligation, even as the nights grew longer in duration, and evenings gathered around the hearth filled with a different rhythm, entirely mending tools, spinning wool into thread, telling stories passed down through a family for generations, playing simple games with dice or counters that required nothing more than a flat surface and firelight to see by. Scholars who study medieval daily life note that this seasonal shift in labour, however constrained by cold and scarcity it might have been, gave rural communities something the busier months rarely allowed: sustained time together indoors with no urgent task pulling anyone away. It is a gentler thread running underneath a genuinely hard season, and it deserves to be told honestly alongside the hardship, because both were equally true at once. What remains genuinely uncertain, and historians continue to debate this actively, is just how representative any single surviving account or archaeological site truly is of the wider medieval experience. A well-preserved Cruck house excavated in one region of England tells us a great deal about that particular village in that particular century, but rural building practices varied enormously across even relatively short distances, shaped by local timber. Availability, local clay quality, local wealth and generations of accumulated half-remembered trial and error passed down within a single community, rather than written into any surviving document. When historians describe how a typical peasant family lived through a typical medieval winter, that word typical is doing a great deal of quiet necessary work smoothing over a genuine diversity of experience that the surviving evidence can only partially recover. It is one of the honest limits of this kind of history, and worth sitting with rather than glossing past. What all of this architecture, all of this generational knowledge, all of this careful, hard-won expertise in holding back the cold was ultimately built upon, however, was an assumption so basic that no one within these villages would have thought to question it. The assumption that winter, however hard, would behave roughly as winter always had. The land would rest, the frost would come and eventually retreat, and by the time the fields needed working again, the worst of the cold would have loosened its grip just as it always did, just as it had for as long as anyone's grandparents could remember. It was a reasonable thing to believe. It had been true broadly and reliably for a very long time. And it was that quiet, deeply reasonable assumption more than almost anything else that the centuries ahead were slowly imperceptibly beginning to test. Winter. Once it settled fully over a village, revealed something about medieval life that is easy to overlook if you only picture people hunched miserably beside a fire waiting for spring. It revealed a level of skill refined over uncountable generations in the simple essential craft of not being cold, and nowhere is that skill more visible than in the clothing a peasant family wore to bed. Wool is where this story properly begins, because wool more than any other single material is what stood between a medieval body and a medieval winter. It is worth understanding why, because the reason is not obvious at first. Raw wool fibre, even before it is spun into thread or woven into cloth, holds a remarkable amount of trapped air within its natural crimp, and trapped air, still and undisturbed, is one of the finest insulators available to any culture at any point in human history. Medieval or modern, a peasant family understood this instinctively, even without the vocabulary of thermal science, because they had watched it work their whole lives. Sheep themselves survive open exposed winters wearing nothing but wool, and the people who sheared them spun their fleece into yarn and wove that yarn into cloth were in effect borrowing the same solution nature had already perfected. A well-made woolen garment worn in layers could hold in body heat with genuine effectiveness, and archaeologists studying surviving fragments of medieval textiles have found that peasant wool cloth, though far coarser and less refined than anything worn by nobility, was often woven quite densely and quite deliberately for warmth rather than appearance, in a way that suggests real accumulated expertise passed down through generations of spinners and weavers, most of them women whose names never appear in any surviving record at all. By evening in the coldest months, a family layered wool over linen wrapping legs in woolen hose chests and tunics, shoulders in cloaks fastened with the simple pin or brooch, and heads almost universally across the medieval world in some form of tight-fitting cap or coif. This last detail surprises people more than almost any other, The fact that going to bed in a hat was not an eccentricity but standard practice across nearly every level of medieval society, from the poorest cottager to the wealthiest lord, because the head exposed and uninsulated loses body heat rapidly, and a simple woolen or linen nightcap addressed a problem that people understood empirically even without understanding precisely why it worked. Feet too received particular attention wrapped in wool before bed, sometimes warmed further by one of those heated stones carried carefully from the hearth and tucked beneath the blankets near where the sleeper's feet would rest, a small glowing comfort that could soften the whole shape of a cold night. Medicine as medieval households understood it had its own explanation for why the cold mattered so much to the body, and it is worth pausing on this because it shaped how people actually behaved. Most medieval healers, following ideas inherited from ancient Greek and Roman medicine and refined across centuries by scholars across Europe and the wider Mediterranean world, believed the human body was governed by a balance of 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, and 2 forms of bile, and that health depended on keeping those fluids in careful proportion. Cold and damp conditions in this framework were thought to encourage an excess of phlegm, the fluid associated with cold and wet qualities, and an imbalance of this kind was believed to bring on the coughs, congestion, and lingering illness that any modern person would recognize instantly as the ordinary miseries of a hard winter. A family did not need to fully grasp the details of this medical theory to act on its practical wisdom, which amounted in the end to something simple and sound: stay warm, stay dry, and eat foods considered to have a warming effect on the body. Spiced wines when they could be afforded. Hearty pottages thickened with grain. Anything that felt and was believed to counter the creeping cold from within as well as without. There is a quieter kind of ingenuity worth mentioning here too, because fuel itself, the wood that made every fire possible, was never simply free for the taking, however plentiful a nearby forest might look. In much of medieval England and France, woodland was carefully managed, often legally restricted, with peasants holding specific, sometimes quite limited rights to gather fallen branches or to cut a defined amount of timber each year from land that technically belonged to the lord of the manor. In regions where trees were scarce, families turned to other fuels entirely. Peat cut and dried from the wetlands of Ireland, Scotland, and parts of the Netherlands. Gorse and heather bundled from open moorland, even dried animal dung, unglamorous as it sounds, burned steadily and reliably across much of medieval Europe where wood simply could not be spared. Every one of these fuels required labour to gather labour that had to be completed before winter closed in, because a family that entered December without enough fuel stored away faced a danger just as real as an empty grain store, only colder and often quieter, in the way it crept up on a household through the long dark hours of the night. Does it surprise you that medieval villages developed their own informal systems for sharing warmth on the coldest nights, the way modern communities might share tools or childcare? It should not, because interdependence of exactly this kind runs through nearly every account we have of rural medieval life. In many parishes, the church itself, often the largest and most solidly built structure in the entire village, became an informal gathering point during the harshest stretches of winter, its thick stone walls holding a kind of ambient warmth once enough. Bodies had gathered inside its role as spiritual centre, quietly doubling on the coldest nights as something closer to a shared refuge. Neighbours checked on neighbours, particularly the elderly, and those living alone, a form of care that rarely appears explicitly in surviving records since it was simply expected. Simply ordinary and ordinary things are exactly the things medieval scribes, focused mainly on rents and legal disputes, almost never bothered to write down. What we know of this quiet, unrecorded kindness comes to us sideways through court records noting, when it failed, through the rare surviving sermon, urging parishioners to look after the poor and the isolated during the coldest months, through the simple, reasonable inference historians draw from how small and tightly bound these communities were. A village of perhaps 30 or 40 households, all known to one another, all bound by generations of shared labour and shared hardship, was not the kind of place where a person quietly froze without anyone noticing, at least not without someone somewhere feeling the weight of that failure afterward. None of this erases how genuinely hard the season remained, even at its best, even in a year of good harvests and mild weather and well-stocked wood piles. Chilblains, the painful itching, swelling that comes from skin repeatedly exposed to cold and then warmed too quickly, appear again and again in what survives of medieval medical writing, treated with ointments made from mutton, fat wax, and various herbs believed to soothe inflamed skin, remedies that, interestingly, modern medicine recognizes as having at least some genuine soothing effect, even if the underlying theory behind them bears little resemblance to how we understand the condition today. Coughs, chest complaints, and the general debility that follows weeks of cold, inadequate winter diet were common enough that they barely registered as noteworthy in the surviving record, simply woven into the ordinary texture of the season. The way we might mention today that flu season tends to be difficult, without treating each individual cold as a crisis. What emerges from all of this when you gather it together is a picture of medieval winter at its most functional, at the very height of what generations of accumulated knowledge could achieve against the cold wool worn in careful layers, fires fed with fuel gathered and stored across the warmer months, stone walls and thick thatch, holding heat as effectively as their materials allowed, neighbours watching over neighbours, and a body of practical medical wisdom, however differently framed from our own, doing its best to keep people well through months that offered very little margin for error. Historians studying this period sometimes describe it with a certain careful admiration as a genuinely sophisticated system of seasonal survival, built not by any single innovation, but by the slow, patient accumulation of 1,000 small adjustments tested by hard experience and passed down mostly through memory and habit rather than any written manual. From one generation to the next, it's worth remembering this picture clearly. This working system at something close to its best makes what came next considerably harder to sit with. Every one of these careful adaptations, every layer of wool and every stone warmed in the embers, and every neighbour looking in on an elderly widow down the lane, had been built and refined against a climate that, however harsh, had remained broadly dependably consistent for as long as anyone could remember. That consistency, quietly and almost imperceptibly at first, was already beginning to change. Something changes in the tree rings around the turn of the 14th century, and it takes a particular kind of patience to see it. The patience of a scientist sectioning a beam of ancient oak, counting backward, ring by ring, decade by decade, watching the story of centuries written in wood, too old to speak for itself in any other way. Each ring a tree lays down in a year carries information inside it wider, in a season of good warmth and steady growth, narrower in a season of cold or drought or stress. And when researchers gather enough of these records from ancient buildings, from timber, pulled out of bogs and riverbeds, from living trees whose age stretches back centuries, they can begin to reconstruct something remarkable. A rough climate history of Europe stretching back long before anyone thought to write such things down deliberately. What that record shows, layered alongside evidence pulled from ice cores drilled deep into glaciers in Greenland and the Alps, each core holding tiny trapped bubbles of ancient atmosphere and faint chemical signatures of volcanic activity, is a climate that had been for roughly 3 centuries, before this point unusually mild and unusually stable across much of Europe. Historians and climate scientists now call this earlier period the medieval warm period, a stretch of gentler winters and longer growing seasons that allowed European agriculture to expand in ways that shaped everything. Discussed so far, the villages, the field systems, the very population growth that filled those small wattle and daub houses with families. And it is worth saying plainly because it matters enormously for what comes next that an entire way of rural life had been built, quietly and without anyone intending it, on the assumption that this mildness was simply how the world worked. Around the final years of the 1200s and moving into the early 1300s, that assumption began slowly and almost invisibly at first to come apart. Nobody living through the earliest signs of this shift could have named what was happening to them, because the change did not arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrived instead as a pattern, a subtle lengthening of certain winters, a spring that came a little later than the one before, a summer that felt in ways hard to articulate precisely less reliable than the summers a grandparent might have described. Scholars who study this transition, now generally referred to as the beginning of what would eventually become known as the Little Ice Age, still debate exactly what set it in motion, and it is worth being honest about that uncertainty rather than smoothing over it, because the honest answer reflects genuinely careful ongoing scientific work rather than any gap in diligence. Several forces appear to have converged. A documented decline in solar activity, a period scientists call reduced solar irradiance, seems to have reduced the total warmth reaching the Earth's surface by a small but meaningful margin. A cluster of major volcanic eruptions, some identified through sulfate traces preserved in those same ice cores, are believed to have thrown enough fine ash and sulfur particles into the upper atmosphere to dim incoming sunlight across wide stretches of the globe for months or even years at a stretch, cooling surface temperatures in ways that could disrupt a single critical growing season, or compounding across several eruptions close together, several in a row. And some researchers point to shifting patterns in ocean circulation, particularly in the North Atlantic, as a further compounding factor altering the paths that warm currents travelled, and with them the weather those currents had long delivered to the coasts of northern Europe. No single explanation fully satisfies every piece of evidence on its own, and that is simply where the science currently stands. Several converging causes rather than one clean answer, which is, if anything, a more honest and more human kind of history than a tidy single explanation would be. What we can say with far greater confidence, because the evidence here is considerably more direct, is what this shifting climate meant for the people actually farming the land while it happened, most of whom naturally had no concept of solar cycles or volcanic sulfate, and no way of knowing that anything larger than an unlucky run of seasons was under check. Manorial records from across England, France, and the Low Countries, kept by the stewards whose job it was to track exactly how much grain a manor produced each year, begin to show in the final years of the 1200s and accelerating through the early 1300s a troubling irregularity. Harvests that should have been reliable were not. Rain arrived at the wrong moments, drowning fields that needed dry weather to ripen properly, or failed to arrive at all during critical growing weeks. Growing seasons, which in a stable climate a farming family could plan around with real confidence built from generations of accumulated experience, began behaving in ways that no accumulated experience had prepared anyone to predict. Consider for a moment what this actually meant inside a single household, because the abstraction of a changing climate becomes something entirely different once you place it beside a real family working real soil. A farmer whose father and grandfather had planted according to signs passed down as reliable, the particular blooming of a certain plant, the behavior of birds returning in spring, the feel of the soil at a given point in the calendar found those signs beginning to mislead him, not because the signs themselves had ever been foolish, but because the climate they had been calibrated against was quietly shifting beneath his feet. Is it any wonder that the earliest response in village after village was not panic but confusion, a kind of collective low-grade unease, the sense that something about the rhythm of the world had gone slightly persistently wrong, without anyone yet able to say precisely what or how badly? The autumn stores the very foundation of that entire careful winter survival system, built across so many generations, the salted meat and the dried grain and the cheese wheels, laid carefully into cool cellars, depended entirely on harvests behaving the way harvests always had. And in the final years of the 1200s in villages scattered from the English Midlands to the river valleys of northern France, the evidence in the Manorial rolls shows those harvests beginning, gradually at first, then with growing frequency to fall short. There is something almost unbearably human in imagining that particular kind of dread. The dread of a steward walking a field in late summer, watching grain that should stand tall and golden, lying instead flattened and pale from weeks of unseasonable rain, doing the careful arithmetic in his head that every steward and every household head across the medieval countryside was quietly anxiously performing that same season, trying to calculate whether what remained would be enough to carry a village through to spring. In most years, even difficult ones, the accumulated wisdom and careful preservation techniques built up over centuries still stretched a thin harvest just far enough. But the pattern building through these early years was not a single hard season that would pass and be remembered as an unlucky year. It was the quiet, accumulating beginning of something considerably larger, gathering slowly at the edges of a world that had no way yet of understanding what was coming toward it. One uncertain harvest at a time. By the spring of 1315, the pattern that had been building quietly for a generation stopped being quiet. It began, as far as the surviving chronicles allow us to reconstruct it, with rain that simply would not stop. Across a wide stretch of northern Europe from Ireland through England and into France, the Low Countries and deep into the German lands, the spring rains that season arrived on schedule. And then, unlike every spring anyone could remember, declined to leave. Chroniclers writing at monasteries and cathedral towns, men whose ordinary business was recording matters of church and crown, found themselves instead describing weather again and again with a kind of bewildered persistence that tells you more clearly than any number could how far outside normal experience this season had already moved. One English chronicler described fields so waterlogged that oxen sank to their bellies attempting to plough them. Another described roads turned entirely to impassable mud carts abandoned, where they had become hopelessly mired, bridges washed away by the rivers that had risen far beyond any floodline the community had marked or remembered. What makes this particular disaster so difficult to hold in the mind, and so different from the single bad harvest a village might absorb and recover from, is that it did not relent after one season. The rains returned in 1316, and again in significant measure in 1317, 3 consecutive years in which the careful agricultural rhythm described earlier, in this story the planting calculated by generations of accumulated signs, the harvest time to arrive before the first hard frost simply could not function, because the most basic precondition for that entire system, whether behaving roughly as it always had, no longer held. Consider what 3 consecutive failed harvests actually meant for a household of the kind described earlier, the family in that small wattle and daub house with its careful stores of grain and salted meat and cellared roots. A single poor harvest, as difficult as it was, could usually be absorbed because a family entered a bad year, carrying some reserve from the year before, some margin built up during better seasons, some grain held back specifically against exactly this kind of misfortune. But a second consecutive failure meant entering the following winter with no reserve at all, the cushion already spent surviving the first bad year. And a third failure layered directly on top of 2 that had already exhausted everything a household possessed meant something considerably darker, because there was by that point simply nothing left to fall back on. Seed grain itself, the portion of a harvest every farming family understood must never be eaten, no matter how desperate the hunger, because eating it meant guaranteeing there would be no crop. The following year at all began in village after village being consumed anyway out of an arithmetic so brutal it barely requires explanation. The choice between a family surviving winter or a field having anything to plant come spring. Grain prices tracked with remarkable precision in the account books kept by monasteries, manors, and town governments across this period tell the story with a clarity the human accounts sometimes struggle to convey. In parts of England, the price of wheat rose during these years to levels that would not be matched again for generations in some records, reaching roughly 8 times what a family might have paid only a few years earlier, a figure that meant quite simply that grain existed in the markets but stood entirely beyond the reach of an ordinary rural household's ability to pay for it. This detail matters enormously, and deserves to be said plainly because it corrects an assumption people sometimes carry into this story, that these years were defined by an absolute absence of food. They were not everywhere, not entirely. They were defined more precisely and more cruelly by a collapse in the ordinary peasant household's ability to access what food remained a distinction that historians studying famine across many centuries and many regions have come to recognize as one of the most consistent, most devastating patterns in the whole of human history. What followed across the affected regions of Europe is now generally called the Great Famine, and it is worth being honest, gently but plainly, about the scale historians have reconstructed, because this is a story that deserves the full weight of what actually happened, rather than a softened version of it. Estimates vary as they always do for a period with such incomplete record keepings, but historians studying parish and manorial records across northern Europe generally place the death toll from these famine years somewhere between 1.5 and 3 million people, a staggering number for a European population that, across the affected regions, likely numbered somewhere in the range of 30 to 35 million altogether. That means in the hardest hit areas, something approaching 1 in 10 people did not survive these years, a mortality rate almost impossible to hold fully in mind, and one that fell as famine. Mortality almost always does disproportionately upon the very young, the very old, and those already weakened by poverty before the rains ever began. It's worth pausing here on how a famine of this kind actually claims lives, because the honest answer is rarely starvation alone. Standing